Okay, and I want to talk about, again, returning to the idea of types of organizational developmental interventions. And this is not an exhaustive list, but again, we're kind of getting to some of the things that we often see are kind of best practices in organizational development. The first one is fairly simple. It's just creating an internal feedback loop through surveys. So a lot of organizations have moved to some form of yearly pulse survey or opinion survey, or basically just a way to actually gather information about the current climate, current attitudes, and current opinion of the employees within that organization. And what this allows is once you have that, you're gathering data of one of the first red flags for the need of organizational development, changes in people's attitudes and morale or job satisfaction. But you're also creating a communication structure within your organization where you're gathering needed data to create basically those pre-tests and post-tests to look for changes. And you're also creating an organization that understands that there is a mechanism for them to communicate how they're experiencing their job to the organization itself through these feedbacks. We talked about team building, the idea that a lot of organizational development often looks at structural process where the structure of the organization is still a very hierarchical structure that is no longer conducive to environmental changes. And though not all organizations will benefit from moving to team building, and we'll talk about this when we get to team building specifically, a lot of times that is a go-to answer in organizational development. We talked about total quality management, kind of getting the entire organization to start thinking about how does the customers actually interact with our products. Gain sharing basically is a broad term representing trying to come up with a way to actually make people more invested in the organization by tying their actual tangible benefits to organizational success. Positive organizational development, we're going to talk about the differences between doing organizational development in a proactive way. In other words, we're trying to change the organization to predict changes so that we're ready for them, compared to more of a crisis management organizational development. The only reason we're doing it is that we have to. We're going to talk about also organizational transformation. So again, kind of develop the differences between when we're developing an organization in a structural and planned manner versus having to do fast transformations, for example, in the process of mergers or organizations, having to do rapid downsizing. And we're also going to discuss technostructural interventions. This basically means that we're moving the organization from one existing structural path, for example, individual departments each dealing with a product, to maybe a more of a matrix organization where if you're in marketing, you work on all products throughout the organization. And we're going to talk about how each one of those may be a better answer for an organization and at least worth consideration. So the main thing I want to touch in this last module for the first week is the 5-step model of change, which we're going to be talking about throughout this course, and that your project paper is going to be based on as well. And this is, again, kind of bringing in that idea of Kurt Levin's action research model, that OD is a continuous process with an emphasis on viewing the organization through basically through open systems model, that the organization is a system, and those systems consist of interacting and relating elements. So the 5 stages, just briefly, is stage 1 is anticipating the need for change. So this is that initial cultural or organizational awareness that a change is needed, or that the organization wants to change in ways that will make productivity and success within the organization more likely. Our second stage is actually developing the practitioner-client relationship. So this is more focused on kind of when an external consultant is being brought in at the start of organizational development, but it can also represent the importance phase of the practitioner within the organization itself, so an internal practitioner, making sure the lines of communication are flowing between the actual decision makers and the people that are going to be the boots on the ground for this intervention. Once you have that communication line set up, once there's that trust established and that need for change, stage 3 is actually the diagnostic phase. So what is the problem? Where is it occurring? What part of that open system needs to be developed or enhanced to help the organization with its issues? This will also be where we're actually identifying the outcomes that need to be changed and how we're going to pre-measure them to then be able to determine if our intervention is having effect. Stage 4 is the actual planning and creation of the interventions. and the actual implementation of those interventions. And then stage five is the self-renewal, monitoring, stabilization. So that's basically where we're checking, is it working? If it isn't, what else do we need to do, which gets us back to stage one. Or it puts us into the self-renewal, monitor, and stabilization. It's working, but now we can't just walk away from it and assume it's always going to work. We're going to keep looking to see if a new problem arises. So stage one is where we actually enter the process as an OD professional. There is a problem that's been identified, and the organization, at least at top level, is interested in actually fixing that issue. Separation is what occurs when the actual OD professional is no longer necessary to the process. So as an external OD specialist, usually my job is to train people within an organization to become their own organizational development specialist, much like this course is hopefully doing for you. It's the process of actually creating this cyclic process that will occur now naturally. In other words, one of the main interventions of OD is creating an organizational structure that looks for further OD without necessarily needing an external consultant. So we're just going to briefly hit each of these phases. The rest of the course is actually built around these phases, so we're going to be spending a week on each of them effectively, and then talk about major developmental programs that we can use within these 5 stages. So again, stage one is the anticipating the need for change. Someone recognizes that need, a call is going out, there is something in the environment or something within the organization that has initiated the desire, hey, we want to do things differently. Must be felt that there is a need for change. So there has to be some driving force with decision-making power within the organization that understands change is needed. And this can be caused by both external or internal influences. And usually this is the phase where the decision makers decide we need to actually put someone in charge of creating change. We need to create a change agent. Step 2 is that change agent now needs to develop the practitioner-client relationship. So the practitioner is entering the system at this point. Now this can be an external or an internal consultant, but both of them, the phase is pretty much the same. It's negotiating what powers do I have as the change agent, what change are you wanting, what are you willing to put in as far as resources into this change, so what are the parameters. So good impressions are fairly important, and really what's happening here is the practitioner, whether internal or external, is basically establishing an initial relationship of trust and open communication with the upper levels of the organization, those that are driving the need for this change. Stage 3 is the diagnostic phase. So basically the practitioner and the client, internal or external, basically start gathering data. And the objective is to understand the problem that the client has. And the client here generally is going to be upper management, to avoid assumptions or to verify. So a lot of times when a need for change occurs, upper management already thinks it knows what the problem is. And sometimes they're right. They know their organization. But we do want to go through the scientific study of, is that actually the problem? So we want to verify that assumption at the very least and try to avoid making assumptions. We want to keep an open mind to letting the data tell us where the problem actually lies. Once we've identified the problem, we now want to identify causes or tension points that could be changed to create a solution to that problem. And finally, we want to actually select our change strategy. So what models or what interventions are we going to use? Stage 4 is the actual action plan, strategies and techniques. So the suggestions are actually implemented. Series of interventions, activities, or programs. And this is a pretty busy time because this isn't just about rolling out the interventions. It's also about making sure they're actually being adhered to and implemented throughout the organization. And they should be, of course, aimed at increasing effectiveness and apply the OD techniques that we're going to talk about, the various potential best practices that can be used in the field of OD. And finally, like I said, Model 5 is the program stabilizes, the need for the practitioner, at least at the moment, decreases, and we go more into a monitor. So we're going to look at the outcomes. We're going to look at that post-test information. Have we actually fixed the problem? And if we have, we're then going to help to stabilize the change, monitor and make sure that the interventions are still being maintained. People are basically owning the new behaviors, the new way of doing things, and they're not slipping back to the old ways. Or if we find the intervention did not work or did not work enough, we may be starting the process over. Okay, we need further intervention to really handle this problem. And often there will be a gradual disengagement of the practitioner from this process until the need for next change occurs. Just a few other theories I want to just broadly talk about, and these are again models to help you think about how to conceptualize change in organizations and changing people's behavior, but also how you can use these models to communicate to others the need for change. And one of the first ones that I often use is the theory of planned behavior. It basically illustrates how difficult it is to actually change a behavior. And the idea here is that if you're wanting to change a behavior, a lot of times what people target is just attitudes. The idea, well, if I change someone's mind, that's going to change their behavior. If I convince someone in an argument that they should vote for a particular candidate, that they're going to go and vote for that candidate. But there's a problem with that, because behaviors alone are not predicted just by attitude. It's a part of it. What we're wanting to do is we're wanting to make sure someone is moved to the intention to do the behavior. And the intention to do a behavior is a combination of the person's attitude. Do they want to? Do they agree that it's a behavior that's needed? The norms, do they feel like doing that behavior will be supported by the people that they care about? And finally, do they think they actually can do that behavior? If any of that is missing, behavior is not going to change. So if I change someone's attitude and I convince them to vote for a particular candidate, but then they think to themselves, yeah, but my entire family's against that candidate, all my friends are against that candidate, I don't want to necessarily talk to them about who I'm going to vote. I'm not so sure I'm actually going to do it. And finally, yeah, and the voting booth, the voting is on 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. on a Tuesday. I work that day. I can't. So in order to convince someone to change a behavior, we need to convince them that they want to. We need to change their attitude. We need to make sure that the norms, the organizational culture, supports that change. In other words, they're going to feel like moving that behavior in the direction we've asked them to, that we've convinced them to, is also going to be something everyone else is going to be wanting to do too. And finally, that we have given them the tools and the latitude to allow them to do that. In other words, they feel that they can change that behavior. Now, the only way to get to behavior outside of this model is perceived behavioral control alone. So someone who thinks they can do the behavior may ignore norms and may even ignore their own attitude and just do it. Do this behavior or you're fired. Well, I can do that behavior and I don't want to be fired, so fine, I'll do it. That's that dotted line. But that's not a very good way to get consistent behavior. The best way to get consistent behavior is to convince someone that they want to do it, that it will be supported by the others around them that they care about, and that they have the tools and resources to do that behavior. The three of those together should always be a major component of any attempt to change individuals' behaviors in an organization. So I'm not going to go much into detail. This is more of a couple slides to remind you that in the textbook there are some really great examples of various organizational development applications that have happened. So one of the things that they talk about is, for example, GE's Epicenter for Change. And this is an example of an organization that tried to move itself into more of a kind of learning organization. I strongly suggest you take a look at these. Like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because these are basically just reminders that the book itself has some really good examples to help you kind of conceptualize what does organizational change look like in real organizations. And Starbucks is another good example. We'll leave no one behind at Starbucks, a unique cultural instrument in success. And basically this is, again, how Starbucks communicates its vision through training, through self-motivating team players, and maintaining an entrepreneurial spirit within their organization, even as it becomes a very large structure. And finally, I just want to kind of end the module, since this is the first week in the first modules, to kind of just look at the big picture of how the class is structured, how OD is structured. So the first part is where we've been talking about. We've been talking about anticipating the need for change, how we reinvent an organization, how we organize renewal, the challenges to change, and also how we talk about changing the culture to allow additional organizational changes. The second part of this course is really going to focus on the actual OD process, so the roles and styles of OD practitioners, the diagnostic process, and how to overcome direct resistance to change. And finally, that last part is kind of the big part of the puzzle. As part 3, we're looking at processing intervention skills, OD intervention strategies, and employment and power and interpersonal interventions. So those 3 sections are going to kind of take us for the first half of the class. We're then going to be looking at actually developing typical best practices in OD, including team development, intergroup development, goal setting, and work team development. And finally, we're going to end off the class looking at developmental success in organizations. So how to create high-performing systems, how to do organizational transformation, and future challenges once you actually have set up this kind of inducive climate towards additional organizational developmental change.